My word. Sorry about the fact, well, this is the latest we've ever been. Blame the Prime Minister. Quite literally blame the Prime Minister for everything at this particular point. We were delayed because Rishi Sunak has just done quite the press conference. I think you'll all agree. Where to even begin? We've thankfully got some fantastic guests who can make sense of what we have just heard from Rishi Sunak. Now, this was a long-trailed speech, I suppose, which is about net zero. So people actually thought he was going to call an early election, which, given he's about 20 points behind in the opinion polls, admittedly would have been quite the move. Now, what I think we're going to talk about today is, obviously later we'll talk about the politics of this. We've got Adam Bienkov, he's a brilliant political journalist at Byline Times, to make sense of a speech that Rishi Sunak has just made, which is scaling back Britain's climate commitments. This is a desperate, panicked that the government is currently in. And what that means is, well, the future existence of human civilization as far as Britain's commitments has been thrown under a bus for the perceived short-term partisan ends of the Conservative Party. Now, I just want to quickly just do a clip from, because I think this is important context. And this is from Liz Truss yesterday. Liz Truss, you may remember, was Prime Minister for 49 days, crashed the economy and the Conservatives' electoral fortunes. Now, you might think after that, she might just disappear from public life. Oh, no, she's trying to fight for the battle, the future, the heart and soul of the Conservative Party. And I would say she's winning. Let's just hear what she said.
This means slowing the rates of increase to benefits and tougher work requirements. It means raising the retirement age further. And in the energy sector, we need to get on with fracking and abolish the windfall tax. We should diverge properly from the EU so we can increase competitiveness in areas like financial services. And finally, we should, as many other Western countries are already doing, delay implementing net zero commitments, such as the ban on new petrol and diesel vehicles from 2030. Other environmental regulations, which are hiking the cost of living, like enforcing the replacement of gas and oil boilers, should also be abandoned. This will not be easy, but it will be worth doing.
Notice that. So Liz Truss yesterday, kite flying for the Conservative right, particularly going for net zero commitments. And that today is exactly what Rishi Sunak has done. It's interesting, actually, that Labour have released they did quite good pictures at the moment. I don't like their politics, but they have a picture of, which is mimicking previous Conservative attacks on the Labour Party, which previously showed, for example, Ed Miliband in the pocket of Nicola Sturgeon. This one has a tiny little Rishi Sunak in the pocket of Liz Truss. Now, look, Rishi Sunak was somebody who came out of nowhere. He was appointed Chancellor of the Exchequer because his predecessor, Sajid Javid, would not allow his advisors to be removed by Dominic Cummings. So he wasn't loyal enough to number 10. Rishi Sunak was then replaced. He got a short-term political boost because COVID happened and he was associated with free money because of the furlough scheme. And that put him in pole position. He's out of his depth. He doesn't know what he's doing. He has extremely right-wing politics. He's more to the right of Boris Johnson, for example, significantly so. Boris Johnson positioned himself to the left on the economy compared to David Cameron and George Osborne. But Johnson, quite interestingly, has said that Britain cannot afford to falter now in any way, lose our ambition of future on net zero. He said that businesses must have certainty about our net zero commitments. Yeah, the worst person you know makes a good point, meme there creeps in. The likes, energy companies like E.ON have hit out, car manufacturers too, on the rowing back because businesses need certainty, and obviously rowing back on these commitments mean there is no such certainty. Now, just quickly, because I want to bring in our first brilliant guest, we do actually have, I'm worried about subjecting it to him for his own mental health, to be honest with you, let alone my own. But we're going to let's bring in Leo Murray now, who is a brilliant, hey Leo, how you doing? A brilliant climate campaigner and one of the go-to people always on these sorts of issues. Leo, how are you feeling after seeing that press conference?
Oh, I can't believe I've made myself sit through it. I mean, how am I doing? I am reeling. It was enraging to hear. It was the double speak that was so enraging. You know, it was full of up is down, black is white, war is peace stuff. I guess, you know, so the headline is, for people watching, it's really important to understand, he finished his speech by saying, we're still committed to net zero. We're going to achieve it. We're still going to achieve net zero by 2050. But the things he's just announced, the rollbacks on policy commitments that he's just announced, literally just one of those, the transport one, is enough to mean net zero 2050 is unreachable. So I guess there was a lot of stuff in that. It was very garbled. For people who really pay attention to this stuff, we're watching and just going, what? I've scrapped it, right? Plan sorting your rubbish into seven bins. I've scrapped that. There was no plan to force people to have 7 bins, right? So, we're all...
This is what I loved about it, is all of a sudden he said, all these taxes on meat, forcing everyone to share their cars on the way to work, 7 different bins. We've scrapped all of these proposals. What on earth was he talking about? What's he talking about?
I mean, so these are things that don't exist, right? So that's like all of this stuff that he reeled off. Oh, I've scrapped this, I've scrapped that. He is referencing it is the case that the Climate Change Committee, we have a body in the UK that's a statutory advisory body. They exist, the Climate Change Committee, they're called. They exist to describe the least disruption, lowest cost glide path to the targets that the government is legally committed to achieving in the Climate Change Act. So the Climate Change Committee, they're there to tell the government, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that, basically. And then there's lots of options on the table, and the government takes them or doesn't. Now, when it comes to some of these things, so eating red meat and dairy, we are collectively going to need to do this by about a third less, across the whole of the population. We need to eat about a third less meat and dairy. There isn't another way to do it. There's not some magical unicorn meat that we can switch to, that nobody will notice. So there's been repeated calls for, things like taxes on the highest carbon forms of meat, things like steak. Now, those calls have always been met with deathly silence from the government, and sometimes insistence that they're not going to do anything about it. So this has happened lots and lots of times. And when the government published their net zero strategy, which is sort of the live document that sets out what this government, how it's going to achieve net zero, they accidentally published a paper alongside it, which was setting out sort of nudge stuff, right, to help support people into more low carbon behaviors. And they unpublished that. They unpublished that about an hour after publishing it and saying that was published in error. And they issued a statement saying we have absolutely no plans to try to force people to change their diets or to fly less, right? But the truth is, Owen, so when it comes to meat and dairy and air travel, those are things that there isn't another way to do it. We're going to have to find a way to fairly and equitably do collectively across the whole population less of those things if we want to meet our climate change goals. And so because this has come up a lot in recommendations from experts who know how to achieve our climate change goals, the government has mainly ignored those, sometimes said we're not doing it. And some of the things on this list, taxes to discourage flying, taxes on eating meat, are things that have been proposed, but the government has never considered. Now, some of it's compulsory car sharing is like, where's that come from? Nobody knows. I mean, it's like
I've never heard that suggestion ever in my entire life. It's like they've almost come up with caricatures below a Daily Mail comment, on the comment page, and then just said, and we've scrapped it. It's like, what do you mean you've scrapped it?
Scrapped it. So the seven different bins thing, I'm on a WhatsApp group of people who work on circular economy stuff, and they're like, I think this refers to, there are 7 different waste streams, right? So there are different types of things that we throw away at the moment, and we need to have strategies to deal with each of those differently. So, it seems to relate to that. There's never been a proposal of 7 different bins. So a lot of
everyone personally has to have 7 different bins in their gardens.
Yes. That's the implication of what you said. So, like, a lot of this is basically joke stuff that they have there's never been a plan for. So all this stuff, I've scrapped this and I've scrapped that, but it doesn't relate to anything real. The significant things that were in this speech are the plans to phase out the sale of new internal combustion engine vehicles. So we were committed until today to ending the sale of new fossil fuel cars by 2030. Now, not completely, because you would still be allowed to sell hybrids for another 5 years. That was the plan. Now, although initially there was pushback from the car lobby about these proposals, they basically all accommodated themselves to it. And actually, massive amounts of investment have been put behind meeting this target by car makers, but also, you know, by like people involved in grid infrastructure, you know, people who make charge points and everything. So there's an enormous business lobby and huge, we're talking tens of billions, you know, probably to the scale of hundreds of billions of pounds of investment to deliver this 2030 goal. And that's why you're seeing this level of fury from people like the chief executive of Ford. You know, the SMMT are not friends of the environmental movement, right? The SMMT is the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders. They are basically the car lobby. So they work for, you know, they're the trade body for car makers. And they are a very influential lobby group. SMMT are livid, absolutely livid about this rowing back on this proposal, because they've all planned for it. And, you know, they've got business and investment plans that relate to this. And so back to the climate change impacts, this is the most significant thing that's in here, because that date was chosen because the Climate Change Committee had identified it as really the last possible time at which we can continue to add new fossil fuel cars to our roads and still meet net zero. If we're still adding new fossil fuel cars to the fleet by then, you are talking about basically we can't meet the target, or we're going to be decommissioning a lot of cars before the end of their operational lives. So very, very high capital costs. It makes it much more expensive to meet the target or either we don't meet it or it costs us a lot more to meet. So that's like the most significant thing in it.
Just on people complain, by the way. People are saying not everyone has a garden. I don't have a garden, so I wasn't trying to be presumptuous there. Just in terms of I just want to play a little clip, just because I wanted just to how he's framed this versus what actually is happening. Because, you know, some people tuning in might not have heard what he said. If you're watching, do press like and subscribe, by the way, and use Super Chat to put questions to Leo. Let's just have this little clip just as an example.
And now it is time to address the bigger long-term questions we face. The real choice confronting us is, do we really want to change our country and build a better future for our children? Or do we want to carry on as we are? I've made my decision. We are going to change. And over the coming months, I will set out a series of long-term decisions to deliver that change. And that starts today with a new approach to one of the biggest challenges we face, climate change. No one can watch the floods in Libya or the extreme heat in Europe this summer and doubt that it is real and happening. We must reduce our emissions. And when I look at our economic future, I see huge opportunities in green industry. The change in our economy is as profound as the Industrial Revolution, and
You see, this is what's interesting. So he starts by accepting that there is actually a climate emergency happening. People, and he's obviously aware that people have seen what's happened on their screens, know what climate denialism it doesn't have any salience, and any party hoping to be a party of government cannot possibly now claim or indulge.
People went on holiday and they couldn't leave their hotel rooms because it was 50 degrees outside. You know, you can't make
exactly. So what? But what he's doing, and I just want you to kind of respond to this, because he says, "Look, we're a world beater. We've done way more. Our emissions are only 1%. Why should ordinary?" And he's trying to almost toy with class politics here in a perverse way. He's like, "Why should ordinary people in this country have to burden, suffer these huge sacrifices when actually Britain has done way more than all these other countries?" So how would you respond to that?
Well, so no country has overperformed on emissions reduction. So that's important to know. Nowhere in the world is actually overperforming. What we did have until today was world-beating targets on climate change, and that is true. So the UK was the first to come up with this net zero approach and commitment, and to ascribe it into law. Right. So we did that first, and then over 100 countries have followed suit. And that's very significant, and that really was global leadership on climate, right? And that was delivered under a Tory government. But we're not talking about delivery here. We're not talking about performance. We're talking about target setting. And target setting for decades in the future, when everyone who's in government today will be out of office and probably dead in the grave, right, is a very, very easy thing to do. What's hard is delivering the policies required to achieve the targets. And you have to remember, we were failing even before all the Uxbridge by-election and then all this started to blow up. The government was failing on its climate change commitments. It's Zach Goldsmith, who's the former environment minister. Whatever you may think about Zach, the rest of Zach's politics, he is actually an environmentalist. He quit in June in disgust at Sunak's position on climate change. He was like, I'm not being listened to. I can't be a part of this government anymore. And then we had the Climate Change Committee, the statutory advisors. They publish every year, they publish a progress report. How are we doing on this journey to net zero? They published their progress report in July this year, and it was the worst progress report the government has ever received. It's absolutely littered with, you get a red, amber, green settings for across all the different policy areas. And for the first time ever, it was just full of reds. It was covered in reds. So, what's happening here is they're embracing failure. They've been failing, right? They know they're failing. To succeed would require them to do things that are ideologically anathema to Tories, but also painful for some of their donors. But let's just take this point. Like, Rishi Sunak, he cares about the impact of these policies on people, apparently people who are struggling. He doesn't seem to care, obviously, about the impact of all of his other policies on people. Yeah. That's not a problem. It's fine to bankrupt people, drive them into poverty for other reasons, but not this. I refuse to do it. I won't do it. These commitments were going to reduce bills for consumers, right? I mean, for a start, if we were leading on EVs, you would have lower cost, you get economies of scale, you get lower cost, smaller EVs. They're already cheaper to run, right? They're more expensive to buy up front. If you're rich enough to be able to afford one, it's then half the cost per mile, if you're charging at home, right? So that will lower costs for people. And specifically, the thing we haven't spoken about yet is that the new commitment in this, the other really significant thing apart from the electric vehicle stuff, is scrapping energy efficiency regulations for people who own properties, right? Now, specifically, that's owner-occupiers. So homeowners is like a key, obviously a key part of the Tory electorate, but the other bit is landlords. So scrapping energy efficiency requirements for landlords, which were due to mean that if you're a private landlord, you couldn't rent out your property without first upgrading it so that it's got adequate levels of insulation so people can stay warm, right? He scrapped that. So they're no longer going to, what it says in the leak from the cabinet is ever. So we're never going to introduce any more regulations on landlords to require them to make their homes livable in before they're allowed to rent them out. Just absolutely mind-boggling. This is what I mean about the black is white stuff. It's like, I'm refused to put these costs on consumers. So that's like just the direct impacts of these policy changes will make people poorer. But then there are indirect impacts as well. So one of the reasons why we in the UK have been hit so badly by the energy price crisis is that we are very heavily dependent on imported gas. So other countries are less dependent on that. And so they were less exposed. We got really hard hit because 85% of our homes are connected to the gas grid, and most of that gas comes from overseas, right? So Putin, we've been very, very exposed to the effects of the war in Ukraine. The Office of Budget Responsibility, which is not a bunch of sandal-wearing tree huggers, they calculated that it would double overall, because if you delay these things by 10 years, it will cost the country twice as much. And the Treasury has done its own review of this stuff. The Treasury's net zero review in 2021 concluded, I'm going to read it out, the costs of global inaction significantly outweigh the cost of action. A successful and orderly transition for the economy realised more benefits than an economy based on fossil fuel consumption. And most recently,
Yeah, just as an example, I mean, when David Cameron said we need to get rid of the green crap, part of that meant in practice massively scaling back the mass insulation program of homes and businesses, which then led to higher costs to consumers during a cost of living crisis.
So much more. So we've wound up paying so much more because of those cut the green crap decisions. But yes, Chris Skidmore is a sort of turquoise Tory. He was previously a government minister, and he was appointed by Liz Truss's government to carry out an independent review of net zero. Now, all of us who work in the sector and campaign on climate change were like, oh, this does not sound good. And then we learned it was Chris Skidmore being appointed. Well, he was like, okay, that's a sort of sensible, he's a sensible guy. He produced his report just a matter of months ago, which concluded that net zero is the growth opportunity of the 21st century. The economy and climate change are intertwined. The UK is well placed to take advantage. We must act decisively to seize the opportunities in a global race. Chris Skidmore has been out doing media today, just saying this is economic disaster. It's an economic disaster for us. So all of this stuff is going to increase costs for ordinary people, but also for the whole of the economy. It's making Britain poorer. And that is the view of the Treasury, right? It's the view of the OBR. It's the view of their own former minister, Chris Skidmore. It's just absolutely extraordinary.
Just lastly on this, though, I mean, look, let's just I guess not the worst case scenario. Do you fear, as a campaigner and an expert, that we're now going to have, we've actually been spared a big national culture war on this issue. We've had culture wars about other things, Brexit, that kind of thing, but also on everything from trans rights to migrants and refugees. We've not had a culture war on this. Could this work, do you think? Could this actually tap in to a chunk of public and it become a cultural identity, not about the facts, not about what's real or not? That's not how culture wars work. And could that actually be something which could poison the well when it comes to this whole discussion?
Yeah, there's definitely a danger of that. And I guess, the critical thing now is how does Labour respond? Because basically...
Well, look how they responded over ULEZ.
Exactly. So if you look at ULEZ, you can see basically that is Starmer. Starmer caused that, right? Well, I could go off on a whole long thing about ULEZ, but it's a particularly vulnerable example of environmental policy because it does have some effects which people who have enforced car dependency and stuff will struggle to pay the extra costs and everything. So it's a really obvious object of attack. Sadiq was already committed to doing it, and then Starmer's team started briefing against him. The candidate in Uxbridge was like, oh no, actually I'm against it, and then you had two candidates who are both saying they're against ULEZ, but one of them is for the party that's introducing it. Basically Starmer just put blood in the water, and then there's been a feeding frenzy ever since. And of course the war on motorist stuff, which Sunak has been pushing for the last few weeks, shows you that is absolutely what they're trying to do. They're trying to pull this stuff in to a culture war. Whether or not it succeeds is all about now how Labour responds, because unfortunately, the track record has been every time there's a challenge, exactly. Starmer's administration has capitulated basically and just ceded loads of ground. So, oh no, we weren't going to do that anyway. This is the moment for Ed Miliband to shine. Like if they come back strong and they lean into this and they say, listen, the Tories are the pro-pollution party. It's not just about the shit in the rivers. They're trying to make us all poorer. The planet's on fire. All of this stuff will cost money. Look who says it's going to cost us money. I mean, the CBI is livid about this, right? We're not just talking about a bunch of lefties. We're not talking about campaigners like the likes of me. You talk about the motor industry is absolutely furious. There's a very, very obvious response for Labour to this, which is to lean into it and say, they're just giving up. They don't know what they don't know what they're doing. They're giving up. It's going to trash the economy as well as the environment. Will they? There's an open goal. It's right there. Is Starmer able to land one in the back of the net? I don't know.
Well, that's an open question of what I'm about to discuss, actually, the next guest, the politics of this, including how Labour are going to end up responding. But Leo, honestly, thank you so much for joining. Leo, by the way, is the co-director of the climate campaign group Possible, and just one of the best experts on all these things, as you've all heard. So big round of applause, and I can see all the love for you in the comments. So thank you, Leo. Thanks so much for joining, and I'll speak to you soon. Great stuff there. Tour de force from Leo. Press like and subscribe. I'm going to bring him Adam because we've left him waiting, which is very rude. Hey, Adam. How you doing? Adam's a brilliant political journalist, of course, at Byline Times. How are you?
Not too bad. How you doing?
Wow. Where to begin? Just before we talk, I want to talk about Rishi Sunak and just Rishi Sunak as a strategist, which I think is generous. What we see, I mean, it's interesting what's happened here because what you got basically is the road here is Partygate. Boris Johnson is forced to resign. By-election in Uxbridge and South Ruislip. ULEZ, the ultra-low emission zone, which means that older polluting cars have to pay a charge. That's about 1 in 10. Becomes a big campaign issue. Labour don't win that particular by-election. There's a big swing towards Labour. Labour have never won that seat before. Didn't win that seat in the 1997 landslide. But that causes Labour to go, and then the Tories think they sent blood. And then they think the lesson here is if we can turn issues of the environment into a culture war, maybe we can hold on to power. Plus, you've got Liz Truss and the Labour and the Tory right flexing their muscles. Is that basically, do you think, what's kind of happened here?
Well, I think that's the temptation to assume that's what's happening, and I think there is some good evidence for it. And certainly in the wake of this leaked announcement last night, there's lots of analysis saying, this is 5-dimensional chess from Rishi Sunak, and he's trying to put Labour into a trap and trying to reform the coalition of socially conservative voters that they won in 2019. And I think you can make a sort of reasonable case for all of that. But when you actually look deeper into where the public are on these issues, it's not the case that there is a sort of 50-50 split in the country as there was on Brexit for and against tackling climate change. There are large majorities of the public believe that the government should actually be doing more to tackle climate change, not less. And that support is across the board, across the demographics, across regions. Talking to one pollster recently, Luke Trill, who does focus groups around the country, former Conservative advisor as well, and he says that there is just no market in the public for this kind of anti-green agenda, and actually the kind of so-called red wall voters, socially conservative voters in the North and the Midlands, in some respects, are even more committed to tackling climate change because they see it as a sort of their sort of threat perception is much higher than sort of average voters, and you saw that sort of during the pandemic on COVID as well. So I think you sort of look at the sort of reality of where the electorate are. The alternative explanation is this is just what Rishi Sunak believes. He is just a very right-wing politician, more further to the right than Boris Johnson ever was on this issue. And I think that's certainly the case as well. But I think the sort of more convincing explanation for this is that he's just not a very good politician. He just doesn't really know what he's doing. And we've had a series of these attempts to kind of spark culture wars. We saw it on the small boats issue as well earlier in the year, trans rights, etc., etc. It goes on and on. But if you look at the polls over the last 6 months and longer since he became prime minister, they haven't moved at all. None of these have had any effect on the public whatsoever. So I think that may well be the intention of some of his advisors, but I don't think that's the way it's going to pan out.
I mean, their polling is actually deteriorating at the moment from an extraordinarily low base. They were on about 80
particularly his own personal polling in particular has really deteriorated. And this taps into that as well, because although he is a very right-wing politician, he was seen by the public for a long time, and even by Conservative Party members, as being kind of like a kind of Remainy kind of, had the vibes of a kind of sort of socially liberal politician. And so that's where he got a lot of support from people in the sort of blue wall conservative voters. That, and as he's been prime minister, that perception has kind of dwindled, which is why his own personal ratings, I believe, are now starting to go down as well.
And the Brexity people don't trust him, though, at the same time. The people around Boris Johnson loathe him. So he's almost ended up in the worst of all worlds because he's actually an extremely right-wing politician by instinct, I would say. If you look both socially and economically, other than Liz Truss, don't know if you can count her, most right-wing leader since Michael Howard, certainly.
Yes. That goes to this announcement as well, in that, who is this really pleasing? If you listen to the sort of briefings, you saw the Daily Mail front page this morning, it's clearly pleasing the Daily Mail. But then you listen to his speech today, most of it was about how he's still committed to net zero. So if you're among the majority of the public that wants to do more to tackle climate change, you're not going to be pleased by this because it's rowing back on that. But if you're in the part of the minority that that is against net zero and wants to scrap it, well, this isn't going to please you either. So I think he's just going to end up, as we've seen from the reaction from Conservative MPs and big business today, he's not really pleasing anybody. He's just antagonising both wings of this argument, such as it is.
I mean, I point to what you were saying there. He's actually just ludicrously over promoted. And the point I made before is he ended up here kind of by accident, because his predecessor as Chancellor was Sajid Javid. Sajid Javid refused to accept Dominic Cummings ordering him to basically take charge of his advisors and centralise his operation under the control of Number 10. Sajid Javid resigned. Rishi Sunak was put in as a pliant candidate. That's why he got there. He got associated with free money because of furlough, got a popularity boost, which, because he was associated with policies basically all Western nations had to do to stop social fabric collapsing. But that's why he used that whole platform as a launch pad to become prime minister. But he doesn't have a strategy, does he? I mean, he reacts to events. He's very, very reactive. And you can see he's got these panicked responses to polling. I mean, that's what he's doing. I mean, they don't actually have much legislation, but they have these sudden panicked reactive moments, which don't seem to be part of a coherent strategy.
Well, this is somebody whose biggest electoral test to date was against Liz Truss, and he lost to somebody who went on to be handily beaten by a lettuce. So, I mean, there is the evidence of this kind of 5-dimensional chess that we've heard about with Rishi Sunak. It just isn't there. He doesn't have a strategy. His politics are out of touch with the British people, increasingly so. His ratings are going south. The policies he's announced today are at best vague, but in some respects will actually be very damaging in terms of dealing with the climate emergency, which the vast majority of the public support. So I don't think the evidence is there that he's this great politician that his remaining supporters still suggest that he is.
Well, he's also a very dishonest politician. I mean, it was underlined by the fact, I mean, we just talked about Leah Murray, but I mean, he goes through a load of policies which didn't ever exist and then claims he scrapped them. He says car sharing, compulsory car sharing. What's he talking about? Scrapped it. Forcing everyone to have 7 different bins, scrapped it. Doesn't exist. None of this, these are not policies that existed, but he's claiming basically this bonfire of non-existent policies. I mean, that itself is a thoroughly dishonest approach.
I think a tax on meat was another one that he listed. It was never a policy announcement by his government or any previous government. Again, this goes back to undermining his weakness. He became in large part, he became prime minister because of the widespread perceptions within his own party and within the public of Boris Johnson's serial dishonesty. Well, it's not perceptions. He was serially dishonest. And and so he had an opportunity, and he tried to take advantage of that opportunity to set himself up as a different kind of politician. And I'm sure you remember his sort of speech from Downing Street where he said, this is a government based on accountability and integrity and professionalism. Well, he's completely undermining that by pulling off these kind of tricks, which everyone can see through. There was never any policy for taxing meat or for the long list of other things that he's tweeted about this afternoon. So he's completely undermining his own sort of case as a politician and his own case as a government. And I can't see how this is going to end well for him.
And you can see why he shifted onto this out of desperation, because obviously their focus before in terms of the culture was stop the boats, a completely stupid and self-defeating approach, whatever you think about the issue. I mean, obviously more arrivals by boats because they shut down safe and legal routes. We have fewer asylum seekers than the earlier part of the century, but just far more arriving by boats because those safe and legal routes are gone. But those boats are not going, even if there's 20 boats or 20 people arriving, you haven't stopped the boats. So, they've doubled down on that. Obviously, you ended up with a whole disaster with the boat, Legionella disease, all the rest of it, blew up in their face. But they kept going on about that. It hasn't worked. And all it does is raise attention to their failure to deal with a crisis they've conjured up and made into a big deal. So now they're pivoting onto this instead. That seems to be what.
I agree.
They've abandoned that.
I mean, you're completely right. The salience of immigration as an issue had massively decreased in after Brexit. And so all he's done, he managed to do, is raise the salience of it. You see it in the polling, in Ipsos's polling, saying which are the issues that people most care about. It's gone up in the polls. But who do people trust more in immigration? It's the Labour Party. So all he's managed to do is raise the salience of an issue that people believe he's completely failed on, and boosted the Labour Party on an issue where previously they'd been seen as quite weak by the general public. So it's, once again, terrible political strategy from Rishi Sunak.
The other thing I did want to ask is about Labour, though, because what happened with ULEZ was actually the polling shows with the ultra low emission zone, which was expanded to outer London, which, as I said, only affects 1 in 10 vehicles. There's a car scrappage scheme and so on. The polling showed actually most Londoners back that scheme. And actually, lots of polls suggest either even like 50-50 support in outer London, or even some suggested more than not support it in outer London. But what happened was, in that by-election, after the by-election, because Labour didn't win it, though Labour did well. I mean, it's still a result which suggested Labour's on course to win an election, but Labour panicked. And what Keir Starmer did is threw the most, the London Labour mayor under a bus, and tried, and both him and, it should be said, other leading Labour lights blamed ULEZ and blamed Sadiq Khan for that policy. And I worry that allowed the Tories to scent blood, because they thought, well, actually, if we forced Labour into a bit of a tailspin on this particular issue and we stopped them winning that seat, what do you think? Do you think Labour will hold, the line on? I mean, they've already watered down the £28 billion a year climate commitment. They watered down the new oil and gas, because they said they'd accept all new oil and gas deals, which the Tories do before the next election. Is the worry that they'll just be dragged in this direction? What do you think?
Well, as you say, they already have watered down the commitment on the 28 billion a year, and on new oil and gas exploration. So the signs aren't great on that. It is notable that we haven't had an immediate response from the Labour Party on this, beyond saying, "Oh, this is just more chaos from the Conservative Party," not giving certainty to business, which is true. But actually, on the principle of this, we've not really had a significant response from Labour. So I do think there's a risk that, and I guess the calculation from Downing Street is that once they've scrapped this policy on such as the 2030 ban on diesel and petrol cars, it'll be much harder for Labour to then say they're going to reinstate that. Because businesses need certainty, and which can't continue to go back and forth and in and out. But yeah, I do think that's a risk. But I think it's a massive opportunity for the Labour Party actually to get on the right side of public opinion on this, and on the right side of the substance of this, which is obviously climate change is a massive problem. It's going to be the biggest crisis facing the entire globe over the coming decades. So they need to be on the right side of this. So far, they've been worryingly silent on the issue, but we'll see if we get anything over the coming hours and days on it.
And lastly, just in terms of, look, we're likely to have an election. I mean, some are now saying this is actually a sign that a spring election could be on the cards. So next May, that is entirely possible, and this is the beginning of their campaign. I mean, I suppose just in terms of how this pans out, because as you said, the Tories are now in a truly they're heading towards where they were under Liz Truss in the polls. That's where they're heading back. I actually think Liz Truss permanently detonated any chances they will of winning the next election. I think that whole experience, people just decided, look, whatever you do now, we've clocked out. We're going to get rid of you. This is just ridiculous.
I think so. I agree. Yeah.
But I think what it just shows in terms of their strategy for an election, the whole point of what we call a wedge issue in politics is you're supposed to divide your opponents. You're supposed to cause a split with your opponents and their supporters. But they've only managed to do this. They've divided the Conservatives. They've got Boris Johnson denouncing them. They've got various Conservative MPs and politicians denouncing them. They've got businesses, which are supposed to be part of the Conservative coalition, denouncing them. I mean, they are heading for a pretty catastrophic defeat with this sort of strategy, presumably. I mean, what do you think? This is just, for me, I watched this and thought, this is the final nail for a panicked and rudderless administration. That's how it looks.
Well, yeah, I mean, there has been a series of articles in the last few days suggesting that we could be heading to a spring election, and you can kind of see the reasoning behind it. If they're going to fight this on a stop the boats policy, then boat crossings are going to be lower at that time of the year than they will be in the summer and the early autumn. So that kind of makes sense. But I do think we're kind of sort of back in the 5D chess scenario here. When actually you look at how terribly they've handled this announcement today, the idea that they've got this grand strategy for somehow turning around a 20-point lead by May next year, I think is for the birds, really. I largely agree with you. I think from the moment that people's mortgages started to go up after Liz Truss's mini budget, that was the polling had been going down anyway for the Conservative Party before that, but that was the real nail in the coffin, and there's been no significant recovery ever since then. If I was Rishi Sunak, I would want to hang around as long as possible in the hope that something comes up, either the economy improves, or there's some major crisis which can help out the government, or that the Labour Party somehow implodes. There's some major scandal, something that brings support for Labour crashing down. That would be my advice to Rishi Sunak, and I suspect that is probably what we're going to see.
Well, interesting stuff. Not probably the last panicked announcement made by Rishi Sunak as they flail around and their polling continues to plummet. It's going to be an interesting few weeks and months. Do make sure, by the way, you follow Adam Bienkov and subscribe to his incredible newsletter, which he has on Substack, but also read his stuff on Byline Times. You can look up Adam Bienkov, Bienkov. If you're listening on the podcast, on Twitter, so make sure you follow him. But Adam, pleasure as always, honestly. Thank you so much for joining us, and I will speak to you soon, no doubt. Cheers, take care. Great stuff as ever from Adam. Yeah, I think it is remarkable actually how, just in terms of how things have shifted. And the only sympathy I would ever give to an argument made by Boris Johnson, this is heavily caveated, I should say, probably in advance, but you see, the argument he made that when he was removed as Prime Minister, the Tories were only a few points behind. I think by that point, they were on an average of 7 points behind Labour in the polling. They would have had to get rid of Boris Johnson, because what would have ended up happening is the inquiry into, we saw what happened into the inquiry into his conduct during Partygate, so he was dead in the water. But if you're going to remove a party leader when you're behind in the polls, what you need to do is you need to replace them with someone who can reverse that trend, who has popular appeal. And what they did instead is they went for Liz Truss, who combined some impressive skills, I would say, of having opinions on economic affairs, which are wildly unpopular and go against the spirit of the age. The age in which we live is not one where there is widespread support for slashing taxes on rich people or rolling, bonfires of regulation and all the rest of it. But to do drastically unpopular policies and then detonate the economy, that was the moment when the Conservatives, I think, really reached a point of no return. So that's the one kind of sympathetic argument you give to Rishi Sunak. What he inherited was not resolvable. The problem is what he's done since then is, well, you can see with Rishi Sunak, is he's over-promoted in that he only ended up in this position kind of by fluke and circumstance, by essentially replacing Sajid Javid when he wasn't seen as pliant enough, and then being Chancellor when COVID happened. I mean, that's why he ended in that position. But he is somebody who, A, isn't a good communicator. It's not exactly the be-all and end-all in politics, but we're just going to go through the problems he faces. He's not a good communicator. He's instinctively very, very right-wing. People forget that in 2019, what Boris Johnson did is position the Conservatives to the left on the economy compared to George Osborne and David Cameron. And I think that got lost in a lot of the analysis because, given he surfed the Brexit wave, that was associated with kind of a hard right political project, I suppose. That's how it was often seen. But on the economy, they shifted away from talk of austerity in favor of investment. They had this whole, spend on the NHS, education and police. Now, actually, what they did is bake in a lot of the cuts that had already happened. And they did, do you remember all that kind of, we're going to build all these new hospitals, which ended up being completely and utterly deceitful. But, they did do investment in often very cynical ways, often aimed particularly at Conservative voting areas to shore up support, that kind of thing. But it wasn't the old slash and burn economics. So they positioned themselves in a different political space. Now, Rishi Sunak is on the right of the Conservative Party. He is an instinctive believer in, hard right economics. He believed, obviously, what Liz Truss tried to do, Trussonomics, wasn't workable in those particular circumstances, not because he had an ideological opposition to what she was trying to do. But it is interesting now that as his own fortunes weaken, as they dissipate, his political fortunes, that right of the Conservative Party, Liz Truss, is in the ascendancy. It's absolutely remarkable. Liz Truss ended up with approval ratings amongst British voters similar to that of Vladimir Putin when she resigned. She led the Conservative Party, obviously, down a disastrous, catastrophic political path, as well as crashing the economy and with real life consequences, not least for homeowners. And I make that point because that's a key part of the Conservatives' electoral coalition. What he's doing is running towards that. So you've got a politician who doesn't have, the ability to communicate a message, who doesn't have actually a clear, coherent vision other than having basically a series of right-wing talking points, which he's trying to stick to, and do these panicked kind of responses to political events in which he draws on that, on that particular positioning. I mean, it goes against the spirit of the age. My only concern is, by the way, there is a caveat here, which is, and I'm going to go through the super chat. So apologies for the super chats. It's just we had a lot to talk about given we're dealing with an announcement which just happened. The only caveat is, I mean, Adam's absolutely right, just in terms of polling, and it's important to say the polling in terms of net zero, including amongst Conservative voters. My only fear was this YouGov poll, which says 38% says the government should keep its current climate change plans and net zero by 2050 commitment. Slightly more, 44% support delaying or dropping some commitments, although this includes only 17% who want to abandon net zero by 50-50. Now, my only concern there is that obviously there's an overwhelming consensus behind net zero by 2050, is that what he's arguing in practice wouldn't be able to get net zero by that date, but that he's trying to make an argument that is persuading people, which is that we were going to get to net zero by 2050, which you want, because he knows that's what the British public want. But there's all these unnecessary things that make you suffer, which we don't need to do to get to net zero. And actually what's happening in practice is, we saw this with cutting the green crap on David Cameron, where they got rid of insulation programs. What that meant was, long-term, you pay a higher cost for your fuel bills. In a cost of living crisis, that's what ended up happening. But, you have to have a clear argument from the Labour Party. They have to stand their ground by making the point that actually they are abandoning net zero by 2050. That's what Rishi Sunak is doing. He's claiming he's not, but he is being dishonest. He's not being straight with the British people when he says, look, we're going to get to net zero by 2050, because he knows he can't renege on that. The polling is very clear on that. But we're not going to do these partly invented policies, absolutely ludicrous, what compulsory car sharing, this kind of absolute ridiculous nonsense. But other measures on, for example, cars, that's going to end up costing people in the long term. It makes it cheaper to shift, for example, to electric cars. You make it scale. If you look at Norway, one of the world leaders when it comes to electric cars, they've invested, they've made it cheaper and affordable. That's the argument that needs to be made. And it just needs to be clear, because my worry is that they will make this to a degree a culture war, in which, you can see what he's, as I said before, the thing about a culture war is facts become essentially irrelevant. He's now, as the Prime Minister, invented a load of fictitious policies which were never going to happen, like compulsory car sharing and everyone having 7 bins each, different bins. But he's the first casualty of a culture war is the truth. It's reality. So that's why Labour has to stand its ground and have a very, very clear position, which is ignore that nonsense, focus on the fact that they are abandoning net zero in practical terms, and just and going hard. And my worry is about Keir Starmer on ULEZ. I think a lot of people go, well, you've got it in for Keir Starmer. Well, I've only got it in for him because he argues for things and says he really means them, and then he abandons them. And obviously with ULEZ, we saw what happened. The Tories scented blood. That's what happened. I think if the Labour Party should have just stood their ground. Someone put this to me, actually, and it does make me worry. I don't know if people remember, it's the only time in my life before, obviously living through 2016 onwards, when you suddenly feel you're in the middle of some sort of national crisis where politics isn't distant from you. I was 15, 16. It was the national fuel blockade. I don't know if you people remember that. And that was over petrol prices and so on. But the government held its ground. They refused to give in. Even they had the Daily Mail and the Sun, which was a Labour supporting paper at the time, screaming at them. Would Keir Starmer have stood his ground in those circumstances? That's the question someone put to me. Would he have stood his ground on the fuel drivers protest of 2000? Look it up if you don't know what I'm talking about. For those who are significantly younger than me as a geriatric millennial, would he have stood his ground when the Daily Mail and the right-wing press are screaming at you whilst all these hauliers are taking direct action, which is shutting down the country? The country shut down day by day. I remember it very well. That worries me, and that worries me when the climate emergency is obviously now even more of a real emergency than by every day. It becomes an ever greater emergency by day, by definition. If Labour don't stand their ground on this particular issue, as they didn't do with ULEZ, even though that was mostly about clean air, the Tories will sink blood and they'll push harder and harder in that direction. And, in Labour's position, if they end up like, well, what we call the Overton window, which is what is seen as politically possible at any time, shifts ever more against taking tough action with climate, because the Tories, withdraw or abandon various commitments, and Labour don't go the whole way, but they meet them halfway instead. And then that means we water down bit by bit our climate responsibilities. Anyway, that's what we need to, that's I think worth bearing in mind in the coming weeks and months. But I do think, I have to say, when I watched that press conference, I was in no real doubt the Conservatives were going to lose the next election. But I looked at that and thought, they're done. They're cooked, the Tories now, because that is a prime minister who's run on panic. He runs on panic. He doesn't have a clear strategy and he reacts to events. There's no clear sense of the election is on whatever date they're planning it. This is how we get there and claw back our polling deficit. I just don't think that's there. They don't have a real legislative agenda. There's very few laws being passed in Parliament at the moment. So yeah, I'll just go through some super chats. Thank you to Joe Ellis. State daft. It sounds like Rishi Sunak thinks it's too late for climate change. How else can be considered sensible? Actually, I do remember he did I think one of the first interviews he did on GB News when Neil was still there. Actually, even then it suggested that he had, let me just look this up, actually. He had misgivings on this. Let me just check if it was GB News. I can't remember now. Oh, yeah. So this was in 2021, June. Andrew Neil challenges Rishi Sunak over the cost of the government's net zero carbon emissions target. And my understanding is, if I just remember that interview from back at this, I'm just clicking on the GB News link. Sorry, can't find the page you're looking for. Oof. Have they just erased all of Andrew Neil's interviews? That is brutal. Those guys, they don't mess around, do they? Well, anyway, I can't find the interview because it got erased from GB News. It's like Stalin's Russia over there. Oh, here we go. I'll see a Daily Mail report, which was Rishi Sunak, blah, 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 talking about the triple lock. And then he was asked about the cost of net zero. Neil says, the truth is, Danson, the Treasury knows it just won't make it public. The costs are eye-watering. And then he says, of course, there are costs and transitions, and the Committee for Climate Change has talked about it. And then he goes through looking through the costs of it and saying he's a fiscal conservative, and saying there was costly transitions. Yeah, at the time, he seemed a bit umming and ahhing. So, I don't think he's someone who's particularly ideologically committed to the issue of the climate emergency. And I think there were warnings there. David Watter, he's sacrificing our future so he can keep his premiership going a little longer. Would Labour backtrack on this, or they keep yamming about fiscal responsibility while offering out? Well, two big dangers there, David. Let's be honest. I mean, he is obviously, yes, by definition, he's sacrificing our future, or trying to sacrifice our future so he can try to keep his premiership going longer. This is a desperate throw of the dice. I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's got the salience he thinks it does. But what he's doing, any politician who scales back climate commitments is helping to imperil our future as a civilization. There's just no getting around it. That's what it means in practical terms. And, Labour have obviously repeatedly shifted towards the Conservative position, and we saw what they did over ULEZ, which I keep banging on about. Tad Campbell, always the voice of reason. Belgium has 4 different bags for household waste. Well, clearly that's not become a national culture war. I mean, to be honest, if I go down the road, there's a few different big bins for recycling. The world hasn't collapsed. yeah, I upset people before because I said in terms of people's gardens. I don't have a garden either. We don't have any bins outside in that regard. Yes, but obviously it's just ridiculous. Carl Hamilton, devastated to find the Tatlazonian metaphor. Well, we live in hope, don't we? State daft, similar theme. Whatever happened to spontaneous human combustion during Rishi's speech? Well, State daft, there were probably Conservatives saying sink the boats. I think I've seen it even. Well, they were talking about apparently using wave machines, and yes, and using the Royal Navy. Yeah, I mean, obviously, when they're talking about pushbacks or whatever, they're imperiling or threatening the lives of desperate people in the sea. Henry, in relation to Super Chat 3008, would you like to discuss a plan to weaken Starmer? Sent you a message on Patreon. Zoni. I'll respond to that. I'm not just quickly on weakening Starmer. I mean, obviously, I'm not a fan of Keir Starmer. Just to be real, if I'm just going to be real, Keir Starmer isn't going to go before the next election. I would much prefer someone else to be leading the Labour Party. But in practical terms, we're just stuck with that guy as leader of the Labour Party. How people vote in the next election is obviously up to you. The only thing I would say is vote to kick out the Conservatives. So I don't think that's a realistic strategy. David, Britain seems to be played by some of its dumbest and dishonest careers politicians in a long time. How do we get rid of this lot? Yeah, I mean, look, the political establishment is just awful. At the moment, it really is the pits. And you know what? Even if, without going, talking about dewy-eyed about an age in which I didn't actually live, but politics in the past, you did actually have very significant political figures with heft, and if I look back to, in even, with the Labour Party from left to right, these were significant figures, like from Barbara Castle, Tony Benn, Jim Callaghan, Harold Wilson, David Owen, dare I say. I mean, these were all, from left to right. They were, very Jenny Lee, obviously going back, Nye Bevan, Ernie Bevan, Herbert Morrison, Stanley Cripps. Very substantial figures. Hinterlands, often great orators, thinkers. This lot are just shit, aren't they? I mean, again, with the Conservatives, they had very significant, substantial figures. Margaret Thatcher was a very substantial figure. I mean, despise everything she did to the country, but what were you going to say? She wasn't a substantial figure. She was a lightweight. I don't think so. Ted Heath as well, for that matter. I mean, Michael Heseltine. Yeah, they were big figures. These people are awful politically and just bad politicians. With, I mean, it is astonishing case study, Britain, in the last, well, obviously since the Conservatives particularly took over, just national decline. It's just absolutely incredible to watch a country which I think obviously got so, part of the problem is bound up in imperial pretensions. Britain is not an empire, and obviously lots of people haven't come to terms with that. Britain is a country which isn't, which is below Germany on rungs of power. But, just in terms of everything that's happened, I mean, I guess a liberal would talk in grand terms about the decline of our international stature. Objectively true. But I mean, obviously Britain's become a more isolated country, but in terms of, if you just look at everything from infrastructure, just quite literally crumbling and falling to pieces, living standards, the most severe squeeze in living standards in modern history. In terms of public services in the public realm, it's just an extraordinary decline. It's just this, there was a period after World War II, particularly 30 years, where there was just huge progress. Living standards went up at the most astonishing rate ever. We had huge economic growth. The biggest economic growth post-war was the 1960s, that period of nationalisation, state intervention, strong trade unions, high taxes on the rich. Best growth we've had. And things got better. So public services got better. The National Health Service got better. Infrastructure got better. It was just, every generation got better off than the generation before. And, that was a great, people called it at the time the golden age of capitalism, or the French call it the Trente Glorieuses. And what we just had is this astonishing great decline. I mean, it's a great reverse. It's absolutely astonishing. And you can just see it, you know, with a caliber as well of the political elite. These are just, you know, just bizarre middle managers and management consultants who've taken over British politics, who often, to be honest, have, you know, they have ideological convictions which are not matched by a level of competence on the Conservative Party. And then you've got a Labour Party where they don't have any ideological convictions and they're often just complete lightweights. The British tragedy. He's an existential threat to British democracy. The British Erdogan, we must stop him. Well, to be honest, I mean, I don't think that just because he's going to lose. You know, Erdogan in Turkey obviously keeps winning and they set up a, you know, it's not really a democracy, Turkey, is it? It's not a great autocratic regime where everything is rigged in favour of the government. I've been to Turkey. I've interviewed opposition figures. We're not, thankfully, Turkey. We have had a decline in democratic life and civil society. There's no point pretending otherwise. But we are going to stop him because he's going to lose the election, in my view. The issue then is what comes next. And, you know, it's not going to be as bad as this, is the best we can say. You know, but where's the hope? People want hope now, don't they? I would bear in mind, it's just fascinating hearing this tawdry little speech on reneging on the Conservatives' climate commitments, which they made in the last general election. So he's reneging on the Conservatives' electoral commitments, should be said. The next generation are not going to stand for this or for Labour's own watering down of their commitments. I firmly believe younger people are really committed on this. They believe it. They're the ones who are going to face, you know, pay the greatest price. They're going to live through, I would say, some pretty gruesome times. A lot of us are. You know, I'm in 39, 30 years' time, 69 years old. You know, I would worry about what the world looks like what would that be? 2053. But I think, you know, they're going to demand, you can already see it, the climate movements across the country and how they mobilize younger people. I do always believe passionately certainly in Britain and the United States in how younger people, I think, are committed to, you know, transforming the world. And we don't have, obviously, a political elite at the moment which reflects, I think, that profound shift which has happened amongst certainly millennials and Generation Z in Britain, but it will come. Something's going to have to give. Someone said, sorry, Henry says, I see. Sorry, he says Starmer is British Erdogan. Yeah, Henry, I don't agree. I don't agree with that. I cannot emphasize enough how much I have no time for Keir Starmer in how he's reneged on his pledges. I also am worried about his authoritarian tendencies. You can see how authoritarian his rule of the Labour Party has been. Also, when he calls for things like clampdowns on climate protesters, you know, the new Labour was authoritarian. I don't think we'll end up like Turkey under a Labour government. But that doesn't mean I think, you know, I'm looking forward for their record on civil liberties. When I first started working for John McDonnell, who ended up Labour Shadow Chancellor, but I worked for him 2005 to 2008. And the first week I was there, we were helping to coordinate a backbench rebellion and 90 days detention, which Labour lost that week. It was the first time they'd lost the vote, and I joined that week. So, you know, lucky charm there. But yeah, I'm aware of the Labour right's terrible record in civil liberties, and I worry about that, but that doesn't mean we'll end up like Erdogan. Anyway, right. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for joining us. And sorry it was... well, not chaotic, but basically we were doing a show on a press conference which didn't end by the time we started. But I think the guests were great and we got through, I think, what's actually happening at the moment as best we could. Thanks. I went through all the super chats, so I don't think I need to thank you again, do I? But thank you to all of them. They were great. Really appreciate everyone. We'll have videos, lots of videos coming up as ever, mostly every day. I didn't do it every day last few days because I've had things to juggle. I'm sorry. I do my best, though. We do videos most days, to be fair. And yeah, let's just keep, I think, you know, a lot of the videos, I think in the next year or so, we'll be charting the decline of the Conservative Party. We're going to Conservative Party conference. We got our passes approved. I was really shocked. Both me and brilliant Jack Barraclough, who is my cameraman. We got our passes accepted. So we are going to get, because last year what we did is we hung outside Conservative Party conference on principle, because it would have meant paying, I think, about £1,000 to go into Conservative Party conference, which would have gone into their electoral coffers. That just wasn't going to do that. We could have paid it, but I was like, what? I have to pay the Conservatives campaign fund. I wasn't going to do that ever under any circumstances. But this time we'll be in Conservative Party conference. I think we're going to have fun. I think we're going to have fun talking to Conservative politicians. As ever, you make that possible on patreon.com/owners84. And do press like and subscribe, by the way. Yeah, so Conservative Party conference is in about 2 weeks. So it's just gonna be really fun, isn't it? Oh dear. Can't wait to talk to them. I'm sure they can't wait to speak to me either. So ditto. All right, I'll see you in a bit. Lots of love.